Hello YouTube, welcome back. Here we are at Ferndale up in Dorroughby. I've just made the climb up to what seems to be an enormous altitude here up in the Nightcap Ranges, and it's the most remote location ever for a MAC group held by the Australian Macadamia Society. But as you can see, the turnout's fairly good and people are still arriving. So let's go in there and see what's happening. Again, like with the last MAC group, I'm not sure how much of it I can actually bring you, but I'm sure there'll be some good news to come out of it and some valuable information, which I will do my best to pass on for those who couldn't be here. Right, let's go. So we've just had our first session carried out by Fiona Smith on spraying and spray technology, and the common mistakes farmers are making when spraying their farm. And look, there was an enormous amount of maths and physics involved, all of which I think was probably aimed at getting people to make sure their sprayers were properly calibrated, but very interesting information. On a broad basis, and I'm not any spray expert myself because I contracted in, but one of the big traps is the application rates, and particularly for some systemic insecticides where people are saying, look, Transform doesn't work. What's happening is that farmers are looking simply at the application rate you put in a tank of spray, rather than the application rate per hectare. So how much product you actually have to use per hectare rather than per tank. And that can all calculate back to the number of tanks you need per hectare to get proper coverage on the actual tree. So lots of interesting information on that. I'm just walking through the trees here at the Ferndale farm here, and I don't know what tree this is, but my goodness, it's got some flowers coming. Yeah, it's an absolute delight to walk through this farm, which is beautifully cared for, and I may run into one of the owners later, and if so, try and get them on camera with me. But it'll be back to get a demonstration of drone spraying shortly, and we had one of those last year. I'll bring you a little bit of that and see what else comes up in the presentation. Here's our drone demonstration again. We had one of these at the last MAC group, but I can get in a little bit closer to what it's doing with trees. And it's managed to avoid some power lines as well, which is good. Apparently this year the capacities of the drones have gone up, so they're able to hold more and more spray, which is kind of useful in terms of not having to come back and refill nearly so often. Fiona Smith was asked in his seminar what he thought about drone spraying, and he said, look, it's potentially very, very good. It's particularly hitting the tops of canopies of tall trees, and he said it might have a particular application in hilly farms where you can't use tower sprayers, for example, to get to the tops of tall trees. I mean, I still think the solution for that is probably height management of the trees, but working with what we're working with, that drone is definitely turning some heads here at the MAC group. So I've had to finish this video back at Nutkin Farm owing to battery problems, which would be the fault of one yours truly. I'm sorry for that. But look, the positive is I can take you through a couple of areas I've slashed in the farm, part of an ongoing task to get the place back under control. And the flowering is, yeah, look, it's definitely happening. The nice thing is I can hear a faint hum of bees, and I do see some bees in some of these flowers that are out of season. And as the group was informed it's not just the 344s doing the early flowering, and boy, are mine doing the early flowering. But this tree here is the 660, and the one across the road from it there, you can see quite a few open flowers there. 660 and 741 are apparently really out and flowering almost fully, and H2 as well. If you've got an older farm, there's some H2s there. They're flowering early as well. One of the presenters said, look, you know, the out of season flowering tends on average to be less of a problem where a climate has distinct seasons. But, you know, I mean, that would, you know, the Northern Rivers, if it has distinct seasons, it's not working this year. Maybe further down the coast, maybe someone from the mid-north coast can tell me, are they getting early season flowering? What I've seen in my own observations is the more inland you get and the higher up you get, it seems that the more early season flowering you've got. And that, to me, would suggest that the seasons are actually more distinct in those areas than they are close to the ocean. So I'm not sure I'm a fan of that theory, but we have all that happening. Now, the panel did talk about what went wrong in the 2025 season, and I don't want to dwell on it too much in this video because what I'll be doing is repeating a lot of factors I've already heard from people and that Chris Fuller's told you about in the last episode of the Macadamia show. So, you know, basic summary, short flowering season, bad weather during that short flowering season, a relative absence of pollinators. All of that led to a low nut set. And so with a low crop yield on, we were starting from a fairly poor position. That only got worse through the season from the weather conditions that we did have, so including the tail end of Tropical Cyclone Alfred, lots more rain than we really needed in periods, and you know, therefore developing smaller nuts and smaller kernel recoveries. Interestingly, Jeremy Bright mentioned that in Guatemala, where they get about 6 meters of rain a year, they produce a lot of nuts, but the kernel recoveries can be as low as 22% for a lot of the nuts that they're growing. And it may just be a function of too much energy being spent by the trees on a combination of too much water and the kind of fertilizer they're using. Hold that thought because I'm going to come back to it. Anyway, the low yield on the trees ended up falling into mud in some places because in March 2025 we had triple the normal amount of rainfall. That made picking up our harvest fairly hard in places and uneconomic to do so in places. So, yeah, crop statistics are down, but you have to bear in mind that the statistics are only what ends up in the hands of processors. We definitely grew more nut than is shown in the stats. It's just that we couldn't get it in, or rather we made decisions not to get it in because it was just too hard to harvest small amounts of nut and make a profit from that, even at $4 a kilo or thereabouts. So let's sort of put 2025 season to one side. The more positive part of the discussion was what's likely to happen for season 2026. And there is some good news. Part of it is reasonably logical. A few of the commentators said, look, the trees seem at the moment, with this pre-season flowering, seem to have excess energy. That is, the energy they would have spent on making you a nut last year was denied for those various reasons, and so they're having an extra big go at it this year. And that's why you can run across a situation where, for example, you've got pre-season flowering on your plant, and here's an example, not sure quite what this variety is, but we've got a flower nearly fully open there. But you look everywhere else on the plant, all around here, there are heaps of baby racemes as well. So that if you pretend for the sake of the argument that this pre-season flowering doesn't exist at all, there's still a hell of a lot of flowering that's going to come out when it's supposed to. And so the argument they had was that, look, a lot of these trees are just full of energy. Whether or not you get nuts from this stuff may not matter too much so long as, you know, you've got all these other racemes ready to go. And that one tree is an excellent example that I just happened to stumble across, but it's really what they're talking about, so that there's potentially a good year ahead of us. Obviously, the conditions have to be right, etc., etc., etc. So one thing they asked the panel was, what are you going to do in the next 3 months to, you know, obviously you're looking forward to a better season ahead. What are you going to do to maximise that? Our host farmer said he's going to get out there and kill as many rats as he possibly can. He says it's been a good year for rats. I sort of agree. I've seen a few around as I've been slashing. But he said, look, if you've got any burn piles left over from the cyclone damage where you haven't burned them off, it is time to go and burn them, because what's going to happen is a burn pile becomes a little bit of a city for rats. It's a very good nesting place for them, and you don't want them to have that as their harbour for the upcoming season. Here we go. There's some baby nuts that shouldn't be there. But then, look, lots of racemes. There's your contradiction. So he said, yeah, look, he's going to attack his rats as much as possible, the rat population. He's been putting out a lot of baits and finding that they're all taken weekly, which is a massive rate of take-up of these baits. It must mean he, in that particular farm, has quite a large rat population. It does vary with the place. It does sort of depend a little bit on whether you've got some owls roaming the farm for you. I'm lucky to have that. I can't really measure it for you, but you do hear them around, and hopefully they do pick up several of these little critters. Here's a display for you. Baby flower, adult flower, stick-tight nut. And that's on a Hawaiian too. I don't know why it has stick-tights. Anyway, sorry to get distracted. So his priority was rats, early flower. The consultants were all warning against just choosing to spray. They say, look, obviously, I mean, to some extent self-interest. They say, look, get your consultant in, get them to look at exactly the mix of trees you've got on your farm, how many of them are flowering, how many of them have got more lots of flowers coming when they're meant to, and then make a decision on whether to spray for lacebug. But also, interestingly, where you've got some baby racemes with nuts on them, they're going to have a look and see if Macadamia seed weevil is active and whether or not an early spray could be made to get rid of that. Now, most of us as farmers are aware of indoxacarb, which is a spray that destroys the breeding cycle of Macadamia seed weevil, the same way cockroach baits in your home destroy the breeding cycle of cockroaches. It happens to be exactly the same chemical. And so that could be potentially sprayed early if there's some early setting nut from these early flowers that will stop the cycle continuing or minimise it continuing into the real flowering period, where sort of, you know, advanced Macadamia seed weevil will start causing havoc with your real, as in time, crop of nuts. Interestingly, on that point, there is a new chemical that's just been registered. I spoke to the Syngenta rep who was there on the day. It's called Vertente. It's approved for use on macadamias apparently, and it is now able to be used. Now, it doesn't have the same effect on Macadamia seed weevil. It doesn't stop the breeding cycle. It in fact kills adult weevil, or it kills any weevil it comes into contact with. There is also a systemic effect. I don't know how systemic it is on the actual weevil that get inside the nut. Don't know that yet, but this particular spray also is effective against fruit spotting bug. And the real interesting combo there is that, as we know, our Halloween spray tends to be against, it tends to be a cocktail that we put together to handle both Macadamia seed weevil and early fruit spotting bug. This particular chemical might be well timed for that Halloween spray, so that you're doing the end of one pest. So you've sprayed earlier with indoxacarb to break the breeding cycle, but anything that gets through that can be cleaned up with Vertente, and then the Vertente will clean up the early stages of fruit spotting bug. Also also very much a big pest of macadamias, and still the major pest going into the actual nut sizing season. So that's something to look at over the next 3 months. The question of feeding came up as well, and there was some academic discussion which bemused some of us, but I tried to follow it as well as I could. And that is, there definitely is a growing theory to the point where some agronomists are actively promoting it, to say that nitrate-based nitrogen, that is chemical nitrogen from chemical fertilisers, does tend to stress the tree out. All nitrogen produces vegetative growth, whichever form you give it in. But the nitrate-based nitrogen does encourage the tree to use up its store of carbohydrates, that is its sugars, in producing this new foliage. And if it's doing that while it's supposed to be putting its energy into making nut for you, then you're actually going to hurt the nuts and feed the leaves in the tree at the same time. And that's partly what they think might be going on in some countries where they're getting very low kernel recovery. The solution is the ammonium-based nitrates, or the amino acid-based nitrates, and these are the things that come from the organic foods, the manures. And I was interested to hear that, because I'd sort of toyed with the idea that, well, the last couple of years where everyone's been telling us to feed organically, some of us have had better results from that, but some of us also had better results from back when we were doing chemical feeds. And I was just wondering whether the pendulum was going to swing back a little bit towards chemicals, given that the results farmers were achieving with organic food hasn't always been bumper crop stuff. But the very firm message from the agronomists in the panel was that, no, amino acid nitrogen is the way to go. And in fact, nitrogen generally shouldn't be your focus on feeding these macadamia trees. We really don't want a whole lot of vegetative growth, because when we look at carbohydrates, that vegetative growth can come at the expense of nut size. And Jeremy Bright at the New South Wales DPI is currently doing testing on trees and their yields. What he's done is he's set up a bunch of trees that he's feeding at 100% of a chemical feed, 50% chemical feed, 25% chemical feed, and then looking at the carbohydrate storage in the trees, and also looking at the result in terms of the nuts. So that's very interesting ongoing research. I don't believe it'll take long before the results of that come out. But the takeaway in the meantime is we're being advised very much to continue our manure-based feeding as being most likely to produce a good result for farmers. So, look, some not altogether bad news for farmers at that meeting, and I think pretty much everyone had a good time. We had a nice lunch at the end of it as well. It was put on by the AMS. And look, credit where it's due. Thank you to the AMS. That was a good effort. I don't love everything you do, but that genuinely was a good effort aimed at farmers. Some of the presenters had come to all 5 presentations from the different regions of Queensland and 2 in New South Wales. They'd spent their own time coming and giving those demonstrations to farmers. And I think they should all be publicly thanked for what they did. I just wish that their presentations could be put online. In the meantime, I hope this summary has helped you a little bit if you couldn't make it there. Thanks for watching this episode too, guys. I'll be back soon. Bye for now.